Ladies and gentlemen, a controversy has broken out. Because of course it has. It's 2026 and Twitter is at our fingertips. So everything is a controversy if you squint at it hard enough. But this is actually kind of a legitimate controversy. Kristan Hawkins, Students for America, I think it is, has recently come out and said that she does not believe the death penalty is consistent with a pro-life ethic. And today, we're going to explain why she's wrong. Join us on this episode of The Watchdog. Good evening or morning or afternoon or whatever it is where you are. Welcome to this episode of The Watchdog. Shalom, friends. I'm your host, CJ Cox, and I'm here to tell you yet again that we are indeed living in biblical times. You know, I had somebody ask me the other day, what do you mean by that saying, we are living in biblical times? It seems like it's clever. It's a cool tagline, but what exactly is it supposed to mean? And, you know, at first, it actually was supposed to communicate a kind of eschatological sort of thing, right? Where it's like we are living in the end of days sort of idea, which I don't even necessarily disagree with. I'm just not sure if I agree with anymore. I'm like kind of in between in that regard right now, in terms of what my eschatological views are. But anyway, that's how it started, right? Because we focus so much on Middle Eastern politics and church politics and globalistic politics and stuff like that. And we still focus on those things, of course, but you know, that, like I said, that's just the origin of it. As time has gone on, though, it's actually it's interesting to me. It's evolved into more of a, just kind of a general affirmation about the nature of reality. You know what I mean? I kind of think any time that you live in history is living in biblical times, whether or not people decide to acknowledge it or not, right? Like the Bible is closed. It's a closed canon, but it didn't just, its communication and what it discusses didn't just end in 96 AD when John stopped writing Revelation, or you know, if you have a different view on that, you happen to be wrong about it. That's perfectly fine, I guess. But, you know, so yeah. Anyway, I don't know why I decided the need to explain that, but I did, and so here we are. Welcome, friends, to this episode of The Watchdog, of course, exclusively on the Synagogue News. I want to go ahead and go through some channel housekeeping for you real quick before we get into anything else. So first and foremost, remember to like and share this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit that bell to get notified every time that we go live. Remember to leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, or anything of that nature in the comment section down below. This hat's getting really itchy right now. I don't know why. If you'd like to follow us on various social media, you can. Links to all of my social media accounts are in the description. You can find us on Gab, Parler, Facebook, Minds, Twitter /X, Truth Social, all at the tag, The Synagogue. Certainly appreciate anybody who's given us a follow over on those platforms. If you are on those platforms, please consider sharing this video to those platforms so that we can get more and more people to watch the show. Please do remember to follow us over on the Rumble account, at the tag, The Synagogue on Rumble. I think it's very important that you follow on the Rumble account for 3 different reasons. Okay, number one, we all know that YouTube likes to censor conservative political content, Christian content. They like to censor anti-death content, by which I mean the pro-life, quote unquote, right? Anyway, we'll get into that. We'll get into that in a moment. Pro-Life Inc. is somebody I'm starting to have more and more problems with as the days go on, but I digress. They do like to censor that sort of stuff. They like to censor historical content. Like if you have the audacity to mention a certain German individual who led Germany from 1933 to 1945, Hitler, they get mad about that. And I don't understand that, actually. I'm literally talking about mere mention, right? Like there are guys out there, they're not Nazis. They're not anti-Jewish. In fact, a lot of them are liberal which would make you think that YouTube would be more open to their views. But nevertheless, they have history content. They discuss World War II, and so they end up getting censored. Anyway, going on a tangent, the point is, that is the first reason it's incredibly important to follow us on the Rumble account, okay? Because in following us on the Rumble account, number one, you punish YouTube for its censorious nature, for its censorious policies, by utilizing their competition, right? They don't want you on Rumble. They would prefer if nobody was on any other video sharing platform, period, because then they have a monopoly on the market. And if they were a good video sharing platform, we might have no issue with that. But at the moment, they have a lot of very severe flaws. And one way to punish them, in fact, probably the best way to punish them, is by using their competition, i.e. Rumble. Rumble so far is, I think, the largest video sharing platform on the internet, with the exception of YouTube. So it's also the one platform they definitely do not want you using, right? So that's the first reason, or that's kind of 1A. 1B, in terms of punishing YouTube for their censorious content, is you're also rewarding YouTube, or policies rather, censorious policies. You're also rewarding Rumble. That was another mistake I made, not YouTube. You're rewarding Rumble for not censoring free speech, right? For allowing people to have open and honest dialogue about these different issues. I personally think that if YouTube doesn't shape up religious, political, and historical YouTubers, and probably even the guys who just create content as well, like your SpongeBob theory guys or whatever, you know what I mean? I really think they should all be moving to Rumble. I understand it has a reputation right now as being a conservative platform, but there's no reason it should be. It's a platform that would work better for all parties involved, right? Anyway, another tangent aside there, you're punishing YouTube for their censorious policies. You're also rewarding Rumble by using their platform for not being censorious in their policies. So those two combine to form the first reason why I think it's very important you follow us on Rumble. The second reason I think it's very important you follow us on Rumble, sometimes Watchdog episodes get taken down. This doesn't tend to happen on the other channel, but this is a explicitly conservative political channel, right? This is an explicitly conservative political podcast. And YouTube doesn't like that. YouTube doesn't like that. And they have taken down some of our videos before. Guess what? Those videos that have been taken down are up on Rumble. You can watch them. You can't watch them here. And you'll never be able to watch them here, right? So if we ever get something taken down, and you're like, dang, I missed this week's episode of The Watchdog, or I wanted to go back and show one of my friends, but it got taken down, or whatever it happens to be, guess what? Now you can go find that video on Rumble. So that's the second important reason why I think you should be following us on the Rumble account. And then thirdly, it's a good backup plan in the event that this channel just gets nuked entirely. I don't think that's terribly likely, but it's possible. Again, YouTube does not like conservative political content, right? So if something ends up happening and this channel gets nuked or gets completely demonetized or something like that, then supporting on the Rumble channel, first off, it'll be the only way that you can support. And second off, it'll be the only way you can even get the content, period. Right? So please do consider following us on the Rumble account. Link is in the description down below, along with the link to the rest of my social media accounts. Obviously want to go ahead and do our This Day in History fun fact. Today is the 27th of February, 2026, and it is on the 27th of February, 1864, that the very first Northern prisoners arrived in Andersonville, Georgia, which is, of course, a very, the Andersonville prison is one of the most controversial and infamous prisons probably in American history. A lot of people have said that it is almost comparable to a concentration camp. The commander there, Captain Henry Wirz, was actually charged and executed even for war crimes. And we're talking about a war where the leader of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, and the various Confederate founding fathers and cabinet members and the various Confederate generals were all actually allowed to walk, right? Because of the fact that especially Lincoln, but Grant and a lot of others as well, wanted to make peace, wanted to come together as brethren and say, let's put all this nasty business behind us, right? And so Lee was pardoned, and Davis did end up serving some prison time, but eventually he was not charged. Longstreet ended up not being charged, and Judah Benjamin was in exile his entire life, but he was never charged. He just feared he might be. Jubal Early, same thing. Alexander Stevens, same thing. Nathan Bedford Forrest, same thing, right? So the idea that somebody actually was charged and even executed for their crimes in this particular moment in history kind of shows you a little bit about how brutal the Andersonville prison was. Thousands of prisoners are said to have died at the Andersonville prison. In fact, 13,000 to be precise. And there was only about 45,000 prisoners who were there in the first place. So it's 28% of the prisoners who were in the Andersonville prison ended up dying, mostly due to just absolutely hellacious conditions, but sometimes due to legit war crimes. Again, Captain Henry Whiffs was executed for war crimes after the war. The fascinating thing about Andersonville prison is that it's not actually the only really bad prison in the Civil War. We're not going to go into too much detail in this particular video, of course, because that's not what the point of this is. But Elmira Prison, Fort Delaware, and Fort Warren were all considered to be absolutely hellacious camps, and they were all in the Union. We don't tend to hear much about those ones because of the fact that they were in the Union. And, of course, Andersonville's great for the narrative, right? 12,000 Union soldiers out of 45,000 died in Andersonville because it's basically a concentration camp. Great for the narrative because it makes the Confederacy look bad. Even though the Confederacy as a whole was not responsible for Andersonville, Captain Henry Whiffs specifically was responsible for what happened in Andersonville. But what people don't like to talk about is that 1/6 of the prisoners who were in Elmira, which was actually known by Confederates as Hellmira, also ended up dying. Actually, it's closer to 1/4 because it's 2,963 prisoners died in Elmira. Roughly 12,000, give or take, were actually there. So 25% of Confederate prisoners in Elmira prison were also ended up dying, right? Fort Delaware, like I said, was horrible. Fort Warren was horrible. They ended up having very high mortality rates. And just like Andersonville, it's not as if they were execution camps or extermination camps, right? They're not comparable to like what the Nazis did in Germany. But they were brutal camps. And that doesn't, by the way, that doesn't excuse Andersonville either, right? I'm here talking about how Fort Delaware and stuff like that is not talked about very often because of the fact that it's bad for the narrative. But at the same time, also, we don't want to go the opposite direction and pretend as if Andersonville wasn't horrible. Andersonville was absolutely horrible. Really, the greater lesson to learn from this day in history fact is that mankind is capable of some pretty nasty things, right? Whether that be in Andersonville prison, whether that be in Fort Delaware, whether that be in the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, whether that be in the Trail of Tears, whether that be in the Holocaust, whether that be in the absolutely hellacious Buck v. Bell case that Supreme Court ruled on that allowed for sterilizing of the undesirables, quote unquote, right? Human beings can be pretty horrible, and that's really the lesson to take away from this day in history. Fun fact, really not so fun, to be honest with you. Digression aside, we have an interesting program for you guys today. Before I get into our headliner, I would like to talk a little bit about another online controversy that I found entertaining, to say the least, and that is Representative Randy Fine, right? Recently got in some hot water because there was a Palestinian American activist who also happens to be part of the New York Mayor Mamdani's team. I don't know exactly what her capacity is, if she's like a member of the campaign, if she's a political advisor. I don't know a lot about this woman. In fact, I don't even know her name. Okay, but I know she's a member of Mamdani's inner circle, member of his team in some capacity. And she made a post on Twitter saying that New Yorkers should give up their dogs because Muslims don't like dogs, right? And it would be more, we would be a more open society. We would be more accepting of Islam if we decided to get rid of our dogs. And Representative Randy Fine said if the choice is between getting rid of the Muslims or getting rid of the dogs, the choice is pretty clear. The implication being obviously you get rid of the Muslims, right? And a lot of people got super mad at Randy Fine for being objectively correct. And I'm gonna sit here and tell you I'm not joking. This isn't funny. I'm not sitting here trying to be like, oh, ha, 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 own the libs. No, he's just exactly right. Okay. This is the United States of America. In our culture, we like dogs. You don't like dogs, and that offends you. Bye. Go home. Nobody wants you here anyway. Okay. In fact, Islam is an active cancer everywhere it is in the entire planet, not just here. Islam is a cancer in Saudi Arabia. Islam is a cancer in Afghanistan. Islam is a cancer in so-called Palestine. Islam is a cancer in Egypt. Islam is a cancer in Azerbaijan. Islam is a cancer in Indonesia. Islam is a cancer in Turkey. Wherever Islam exists, there is cancer. Not because Islam brings cancer, but because Islam is cancer. Okay? It just simply is. So, if the choice is between a moldy turkey sandwich and Muslims, you pick the moldy turkey sandwich. Okay? And when I say that, I want to be super clear here. Okay? You have a right to be whatever faith you want to in this country. This country does not have any right to tell you you can't be a Muslim, to prevent you from going to mosque, any of those different things. And I support that. That's one of the things that makes Christianity super cool, is we support that. Whereas Islam supports executing you if you have the audacity to not be the right flavor of Muslim, let alone some other religion, right? That being said, I think the United States of America should deport any and all immigrants who are not citizens, who are Muslim, simply on the grounds that they are Muslim. And if someone wants to say that's a violation of the First Amendment, I didn't deport any citizens. I didn't prevent any citizens from following Islam. But if you're not a citizen and you're a Muslim, get out. I don't want you here. Why? Because you're a Muslim. I don't have another reason. I don't want another reason. That reason's good enough. Your religion is cancerous. It is damaging to society. It is it is contrary to my values, and it is an active threat to the global order and to individual national orders and to individual regional orders and so on and so forth. It just simply is. Okay? There isn't a whole bunch of Jews and Buddhists and Hindus and Christians going out here flying planes into buildings or trying to establish caliphates in Iraq, right? Or executing women for having the audacity to not wear hijabs. You know what I mean? There's only one religion that does those things. And furthermore, you guys remember back in 2017 when Trump passed his Muslim ban, and it was really just a travel ban. It wasn't actually a Muslim ban, right? Well, it could have been, and it should have been. We should say you're not allowed to immigrate into this country. Again, if you're an American citizen who converts to Islam, that is one thing. I have no power, nor do I even want to, take away your right to worship as you see fit. Although no Islamic calls to prayers. Sorry, that shouldn't be legal. But if you're Iranian and you want to immigrate here and you check the Muslim box, we should be like, no, sorry, it's not worth my dogs. It's just simply not. I don't care if that sounds cruel to you. I think you sound cruel to me for saying that this isn't literally obvious. In fact, if you don't think this is obvious, you're stupid and I'm never going to listen to you again. You're either stupid or evil. Those are the only two options. There is not a single ignorant person on the planet as it pertains to this particular issue, right? If you're on the Muslim side of this issue, you're either evil and want people to die, or you're an idiot. And either way, I have no intention of listening to you. I have no intention of respecting you. I have no intention of pretending like we're on equal playing fields, because we're not. You're dumb. That's just the way it is. Okay. And again, this isn't some attempt to be based or to be some right-wing troll or something. Islam's cancerous. It's evil. It's wicked. It's disgusting. It's demonic. It's satanic. It's pedophilic. Insert absolutely horrid adjective here. Islam is that. It's the worst religion, the worst political ideology, because it happens to be both, in the entire history of the world. And it's not close. And on top of that, it also happens to be incredibly dumb. Okay? So, yeah, Randy Fine says, if the choice is between dogs and Muslims, you choose the dogs. Get that man 5 re-elections. Get that man the presidency. I don't care. And for all you little morons out there who are talking about, oh my God, this is just so disgusting. How can a Christian ever say like this? Congratulations, you've just lost a whole bunch of people's respect, and I'm never going to listen to you again. I frankly don't care what you have to say. From here until the end of time, anything you have to say will be as good as Charmin that I discard in the toilet, because I don't care. Okay, I just don't care, and I never will care. All right, so that all going aside, Sorry, I have myself on the screen, and when I started doing the whole wall thing, it's like that looks ridiculous. I crack myself up, man. Okay, we're starting off this absolutely gloriously. Let's go ahead and jump into our headliner for today, which is Kristan Hawkins. Here you can see she leads the pro-life war room, but that is not what she is most famous for. So Kristan Hawkins is a very famous, why am I losing the word here? Pro-life activist. Somebody who I have a deep amount of respect for because of the fact that she's a pro-life activist. She is the founder, I believe. At the very least, she's the president, but I believe she is also the founder of Students for Life in America, which are Students for Life of America, and Students for Life Action, which I did, just to be perfectly clear, if people are wondering how did you get that wrong earlier, but get it right now. I did look it up. Fact check myself. You got to do that. Sorry. I know fact checking yourself in the middle of a stream is probably not the greatest thing in the world, but to be honest with you, I don't actually follow her on, like, I don't follow those organizations. I follow her specifically. That's what I'm trying to say. Anyways, so she is a pro-life American, and I happen to have a great deal of respect for her because she is a pro-life American, right? Because let's be perfectly clear here, the systematic execution of babies in this country is one of, if not the worst thing this country has ever done. And I am not some blind patriot. I am an American nationalist, but I also recognize we've done some pretty horrid things. So, I mentioned a bunch of them at the beginning of the stream, right? We interned a bunch of Japanese Americans. We obviously committed what could only reasonably be described as a genocide against Native Americans. We have Buck v. Bell, which is a horrible, and can I say again, horrible SCOTUS ruling that allowed the government to sterilize individuals who were considered to be undesirable. Still on the books, by the way. We all, wanted to repeal Roe v. Wade, and we did, and that was awesome and honorable. Thank the Lord for that. There are other Supreme Court rulings we also need to be focusing on. Okay, and Buck v. Bell is one of them. If you don't believe me, look it up. Buck v. Bell, Coker v. Georgia, Kennedy v. Louisiana. Absolutely horrible Supreme Court rulings. So it's not like I'm some blind patriot here. I'm deeply conservative, and I'm an American nationalist, but that doesn't mean we have to be dumb, right? Facts are facts. These things happen. That being said, none of those things is as bad as the mass slaughter of babies in the womb that has taken place since 1973. First, you just have the fact of sheer numbers, right? Something like 60 million babies have been slaughtered in the womb since 1973 when Roe v. Wade was passed. All of those murders are technically legal. I only put quotes there in murders because technically murder is unlawful killing. And that's kind of the problem, is those were lawful killings according to the law of the land. Now, according to actual morality, according to the law of God, those were not lawful killings. And never could be lawful killings, by the way. There's no scenario in which they become lawful killings. But nevertheless, under our current laws and under the laws that have governed this society since 1973, they were lawful killings. Meaning when we call them murder, we have to call them murder in a strictly moral sense, because in a definitional sense, technically, they're not unlawful killings, which is disgusting, right? At any rate, because of that, I really like Kristan Hawkins. And throughout this video, though I am going to be coming against Kristan Hawkins, I just want it to be clear that she is somebody who I consider to be an honorable person and to be an ally in this regard. With that being said, though, she has made what I consider to be a grievous error recently when she said, and you can see it here. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in. Oh, no, that's not what I wanted. Why the death penalty is not consistent with a pro-life view, right? She says, why the death... Oh, what happened there? Come on. What's going on here? There we go. Why the death penalty is not consistent with a pro-life view. Man, what happened here? This is going to drive me crazy. For some reason, my screen is now like I'm not able to scroll down or whatever. I don't know what the deal is here. It was just fine 5 seconds ago. Man, this is going to frustrate me. This is really, really going to frustrate me. Why can we not just... Hang on just a second, guys. I don't know what happened here, but my ability to scroll has been taken away from me. And so I'm just going to see if I can pick it back up where we left off on another tab. I cannot. What is happening? It's going to frustrate, brothers. It's okay. She actually posted this argument on Twitter. So if this doesn't work, we can go to... I got it back. Thank the heavens. All right. So she says, why the death penalty is not consistent. This is a professional operation, guys, I swear. Why the death penalty is not consistent with a pro-life worldview. And it's subtitled How I Made Everyone Angry on X yesterday, X being Twitter, if you guys don't know. It says here, the pro-life war room. You can obviously see her picture. That is Kristan Hawkins. That's just the tag she goes by here on this platform. So she decided to write a blog article where she defended the idea that the death penalty is inconsistent with a pro-life worldview. And so what we're going to do today is we are going to debunk the arguments that the death penalty is inconsistent with a pro-life worldview, because actually, fun fact, not only is the death penalty perfectly consistent with a pro-life worldview, but actually the same logic that leads one to be pro-life should lead someone to be pro-death penalty, especially if such a one is pro-life for reasons that are even remotely religious at all. One of the things we're going to get to in this video, she has 11 different points in terms of arguments against the idea that the death penalty is consistent with a pro-life perspective, and all 11 of them fail, which is pretty difficult to do, if I may say so myself. To craft an argument that fails at every single point, I don't know if it's just because the position itself is undefensible. I tend to think it is, because Kristan Hawkins herself is a very intelligent person. But yeah, I mean, it just falls apart entirely. So let's go ahead. And by the way, guys, if you like my content here today, I am doing an episode of Unapologetics on my other channel at about 9 p.m. Mountain Time later on today. And we're going to talk about this exact same issue, actually, but from the religious perspective, right? We'll be talking a little bit about Bible and stuff like that today. But this is a politics channel, so we're going to be focusing more on the political side of things. And then on the other channel at about 9 p.m. Mountain Time, we are going to be discussing what the Bible has to say in detail about the death penalty, again, relating specifically to this issue. So if you guys are interested in more of my thoughts on that, please do consider going over to the synagogue and subscribing there and checking out this later episode when it comes to fruition. Let's read the article in question. She says, yesterday, I posted a simple statement on X: the death penalty is inconsistent with a pro-life worldview. Within hours, the reaction exploded. The post surged past 2 million views, and prominent Protestant voices, including Allie Beth Stuckey and Seth Dillon, quickly pushed back. Friends and critics alike weighed in. Some responses were thoughtful, others were less so. One of the things I want to point out here really quick, because she stresses Protestant. We're going to get to this in a moment, but Kristan Hawkins is a Catholic, and that actually is going to be damaging to her case, as we'll see really in just no time at all, right? The Catholic Church used to have a very harsh view on the death penalty, not considering it permissible, but considering it obligatory, actually, which is kind of a pretty big deal, right? But we'll get more into that in just a moment here. Let's go ahead and scroll down. There we go. So why did I post it? The immediate context was a pro-prosecution abolitionist bill introduced in Tennessee last week, which, by the way, pray for that. We should be very supportive of that sort of thing. A bill that would have allowed the state to seek capital punishment for mothers who had abortions. The legislation died in committee today, and I will write more about that next. Quickly need to note here something. That's not true. It did not die in committee. I don't believe Kristan Hawkins is lying about this. I think that she is probably misinformed. But the bill is currently, today, just on February 27, 2026, still not killed, at least to the best of my knowledge. So that information is not accurate. And we do just want to correct the record there for a moment. She says, this article isn't about the morality of prosecuting post-abortive mothers, which I do have to say, again, a brief aside, but one of the things I actually strongly disagree with Kristan Hawkins on is she is actually against the idea that we should prosecute mothers who get abortions. Now, I am going to probably piss everybody off with this because I do think we should prosecute mothers who get abortions. And I also think that you can't prosecute them with murder except for in very specific circumstances, right? Like, hypothetically, if I were to go hire a hitman, in most jurisdictions, they're not going to charge me with murder. They're going to charge me with something, but they won't charge me with murder. Now, that's not true in every jurisdiction. Some jurisdictions will just say, yeah, actually, that classifies as murder. We're going to charge you with that. And in those jurisdictions, I guess there's no legal inconsistency. But in most jurisdictions, the charge is often lesser than murder, though it's still considered to be a heinous crime, right? And I don't think there's any way you can be consistent on the pro-life position without saying mothers who get abortions should be prosecuted for two reasons. Number one, either it's murder or it isn't. Okay. And if it is murder, if we're actually sitting up here saying that the human fetus is a person and you have murdered that human person, then the one who paid for that murder is obviously guilty of a crime. That's not even a question, right? If you just start to consider the internal consistency, it's actually ridiculous to take the opposite position. It can't be murder and the women not responsible. That's just not an option. It can either not be murder or the women are responsible. But saying this is an act of murder and the person who paid for this murder to take place is in no way guilty at all is absurd. It doesn't make any sense. Okay. The second reason is, of course, sometimes the woman is the abortionist, right? When a woman takes a abortifacient rather than going to a doctor, she is the one who's responsible for killing that baby, not an abortionist. So who's charged in that situation? Who's guilty of the murder? Is it nobody? Is it just a murder that fell out of the sky onto somebody's lap? Fictional murder, Homer Simpson level murder, right? Obviously, in that particular instance, again, it does not make any sense to say this is murder and also the woman is guiltless. Makes no sense because she's the only one involved. There's no second party to be involved here. I guess you could say the drug company, right? But the drug company didn't actually kill anybody. The drug company simply provided you with the means to kill somebody. And I'm not saying that means they're guiltless. I'm simply pointing out that the direct cause of the death in this scenario is the woman. So I'm obviously supportive of penalties for women who get abortions. And I'll go further. Further on a Christian view. I also am very supportive of redemption for these women. Okay. If God can save me, God can save these women. Of course. Of course, God can save anybody he wants. God can forgive anybody he wants. There's forgiveness at the cross for any woman who has gotten an abortion, just as there's forgiveness at the cross for any person who's committed any other kind of a murder if they repent and believe. So, let me just add a little bit of gospel in there. It is not as if it's hopeless for these women. Kristan Hawkins does not believe you should punish women who get abortions. She thinks that is confusing. Her words, not mine. That it confuses the goals of the pro-life movement, and that right now it would not be something that is culturally acceptable, which, of course, in order to make it culturally acceptable, you have to push the culture. You have to move the Overton window, right? So me and her are already starting at a place that is divergent in that regard, right? Nevertheless, as she says, this article is not about the morality of prosecuting post-abortive mothers, and we're not going to talk anymore about the morality of prosecuting post-abortive mothers, because that's not what we're here to discuss. Back to the article, she says this is about something deeper, whether a truly pro-life worldview can support the deliberate execution of a human being, even a guilty one. And the position she's taking today, by the way, friends, is what's known as a consistent life ethic. I happen to believe a consistent life ethic is actually not consistent, which is why I'm doing this video. But that's the position she is presenting, right? A consistent life ethic. It's a view that says we're pro-life, therefore we're not only against abortion, we're also against capital punishment and euthanasia as well, which is not in the scope of this particular article. I am against euthanasia, just in case that was unclear for anybody. She says, and even if you ultimately disagree with me, one thing became painfully clear as I read through thousands of replies on X last night. Too many people spoke about the death penalty with a kind of enthusiasm that should make all pro-lifers uncomfortable. There was eagerness, even a sense of satisfaction at the idea of killing those who have committed terrible crimes. That reaction alone convinced me this conversation is overdue. And I will actually say I agree in this particular regard with Ms. Hawkins. Nobody should ever be happy that any human being has been executed. The execution of another human being is always a tragedy. Sometimes tragedies are necessary. That is something. That's something I want to make perfectly clear here. But the execution of a heinous criminal is not something to be happy about. It's a somber moment. This is an image bearer of God who has been extinguished, and that sucks. Just put it all out there. That absolutely sucks. It's a horrible, horrible thing when that happens. Again, sometimes I think it's necessary. Just like sometimes I think war is necessary. I think taxes are necessary. Taxes suck, not to the same extent, but trying to add some lightheartedness to this conversation. But I agree that there is no reason we should be sitting here gleefully like, oh, yay, executions, right? That's definitely not something that any Christian or any person should be. That's not a mentality we should have, is what I'm trying to say. Pressing forward, she says, what follows are the core reasons I believe the death penalty is inconsistent with a pro-life worldview, not just theologically, but morally and practically. I hope you can use it as a framework when this issue comes up in the future in your interviews, debates, and conversations with fellow conservatives. So, point number one, she says, justice does not require execution. She says governments must punish evil. Hang on one second. I got to edit something here. There we go. Governments must punish evil, but punishment doesn't have to mean death. Life imprisonment can protect society and still respect human dignity. So her point number one, justice does not require execution, to which we must ask the question, by whose definition of justice, right? What do you mean by justice? Governments must punish evil. On this, we agree. Does that punishment necessarily require the death of an individual? Well, I would argue, yes, in certain instances, it absolutely does. And here's the big problem here as it pertains to what she's saying. She's saying life imprisonment can protect society. But that is not actually the point of justice. Justice is not meant to protect people. Justice is not meant to rehabilitate people. Those things can be a part of justice, right? If I remove a deadly criminal, a dangerous criminal from the streets, in doing that, I have protected society from that dangerous criminal. So it's a very good perk of justice, right? But that's not actually the point of justice. The point of justice is to punish evil. It's the first part of her sentence. She says governments must punish evil. The point of justice is to punish evil. One of the things that people often say about justice is it is rendering to each their due, right? Rendering to each their due. Well, when you're rendering to somebody who's committed a heinous action his due is punishment, right? His due is not we just need to do this so we can protect you. No, you're actually supposed to be punishing him, and punishing him severely if he committed a severe crime, for the crimes that he has committed. That's the point of justice, right? That's the point of legal justice. That's the point of biblical justice. When God in the law of Moses, for example, commands the execution of adulteresses, and I'm not making an argument for the execution of adulteresses. I'm using an analogy. Okay, so stick with the point, guys. He's not punishing. Woo! Sorry, knocked over my microphone. He's not he's not stoning the adulteress in that instance because he wants to protect the husband or because he wants to protect society from her adulteries. He is stoning that person to punish her for the crime she's committed, right? And ditto for a male adulterer, and ditto for one who commits murder, and ditto for one who blasphemes the Lord in the Old Testament, right? Eye for eye, tooth for tooth, nail for nail, foot for foot, or hand for hand, foot for foot, rather. The lex talionis, as they say, right? That is what that is trying to say is, look, you take an eye, you lose an eye. In other words, justice should be measured equally, and it shouldn't be 2 eyes for 1 eye. So this goes both ways, right? But it also shouldn't be a slap on the wrist for an eye, right? And I know somebody might say, well, didn't Jesus actually repudiate eye for eye? No, he didn't actually. What he repudiated was this idea of eye for eye as being like vengeance. Like the way we typically see eye for eye when we read like comic books and stuff like that today is like the Punisher, right? This is vengeance. Whereas in reality, what eye for eye is meant to communicate is rendering to each their just due, right? Not more, but also not less, right? So whose definition of justice are we talking about? We're not talking about God's definition of justice, because God's definition of justice requires punishment. Punishment is the point, not protecting society, right? The other problem we have here is, again, speaking about God's definition of punishment, he explicitly commands, especially for murder. Remember, go back to Genesis 9, and he says, if man sheds man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed, for in the image of God made he him. And that's a little bit of a paraphrase, but not much, right? God actually does say justice in the instance specifically of a murder. This is before the law was given on Sinai. That's a whole theological question in and of itself, but at the very least, it's before the act of giving the law on Sinai. God says that if a man takes the life of another man, his life is to be taken. Okay, but what if we're talking about a secular definition of justice, right? Well, again, the point of justice is to punish and not to protect, not to rehabilitate, not to do any of those other things. If I've committed a heinous action like killing somebody, then allowing me the rest of my life with 3 hots and a cot and free time and all that other kind of stuff is not punishment. Frankly, in a lot of ways, depending on what prisons you go to, you can have a relatively high quality of life. And there are morons out here constantly trying to give you a higher quality of life, right? Trying to make sure you get, TV time and rec time and all these other kinds of things, right? Like how is that justice? How is allowing somebody to live out their days in a less than ideal situation, no doubt, but in a situation that gets better by the year? How is allowing somebody to live out their days in those kinds of situations justice? I would argue it's not. Justice absolutely does require execution. Punishment does not always have to mean execution. You shouldn't be executing people for stealing. You shouldn't be executing people for committing fraud, right? You shouldn't be executing people for I don't know, what's another example? Committing a hate crime, and when I say hate crime, I'm not talking about a murder. I'm talking about like writing the N-word in graffiti on something, or graffiti in general, right? Obviously, those aren't executed. But if you talk about killing somebody, or sexually assaulting a child, or trafficking human beings, yeah, justice requires your execution at that point. There is absolutely no world in which you should be allowed to live out the rest of your days. Okay? So, point number 1, yes, justice does require execution. If you say justice does not require execution, then I want to ask you, justice according to whom? Because it's not justice according to the Bible. And it's certainly not justice according to me and plenty of other moral philosophers. So why is your definition of justice, Kristan, trump the rest of ours, especially scriptures, right? And why is your definition of justice right? Why should we buy it? Why is it correct, right? Her point number 2 says government authority does not equal government obligation. Romans 13 gives governments authority, but not a command to execute. Authority is not obligation. Governments can punish criminals through imprisonment instead of execution. And quite frankly, this is just flatly false. Again, we're going to go more into detail on this later on tonight on the other channel, because I don't want this to be overtly theological. But Romans 13 pretty explicitly tells government or implies that governments are to execute people. Now, if you want to talk about this very strictly, I will agree there's no point that says thou shalt execute individuals who commit heinous crimes. Fair. Granted. All right. But what does Romans 13 actually say? Well, skipping over all the parts where it says those who rebel against authority and all those different sorts of things, right? He says, for the one in authority is God's servant for your good, but if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath, to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Okay? And that's reading in a modern English version, but I digress. According to God, he's saying they don't bear the sword for no reason. Now, if they bear the sword simply to say they have the authority to use it, but they never should because that's actually not moral, well, then not only is that a contradiction, but also they don't actually bear the sword, right? If I have a gun with no bullets, guess what? That's as good as me not having a gun. There's no difference, right? I bear arms in a strictly technical sense in that regard, but I don't actually bear arms in any sense that means anything, right? In this particular situation, we have a similar thing. God says they do not bear the sword in vain. They do not bear the sword for no reason. If you don't bear the sword for no reason, the implication is that you bear the sword so that you can use it. And he says explicitly that governments are God's revengers, right? That's what the King James says, at least, not the version we just wrote. But they are meant to carry out God's wrath on evildoers. That is why God has set up governments in the first place. That's not a command, thou shalt kill people who murder other people, but it's definitely a pretty heavy implication. Hey, I gave you a sword so that you can use it against people who piss me off, me being God, right? That's just the reality of the situation. So when she says authority is not obligation, sure, in a super technical sense, I grant that. But Romans 13 in context is absolutely imploring people to understand that not only does the government have the authority to use the sword, it actually has the obligation to use a sword. It is there specifically to use the sword against evildoers, those who commit wrong action, to carry out God's wrath against people who commit crimes. Now, again, does that mean every single crime needs to end at the point of a sword? Of course not. Of course not. In fact, the death penalty should be used sparingly. It should be absolutely used sparingly. My personal opinion, the death penalty should be used for murder, specifically murder that is unprovoked. The reason I say murder that is unprovoked is because I can understand a provoked murder being less immoral, right? It doesn't make it moral. That person should still be punished. But a guy who shoots his wife because his wife is cheating on him, there is a little bit of a difference between that guy and a guy who shoots his wife because he's sick of being married, right? And I think, and the law, for the most part, actually already recognizes that distinction anyhow. But unprovoked murder should result in the death penalty. Human trafficking, whether that be sexual organ or any other sort of human trafficking, should result in the death penalty. Child sexual assault should result in the death penalty, particularly child sexual assault of people under the age of 16. Why do I say under the age of 16? Well, because 31 different states in the country actually have an age of consent of 16. So the law does recognize a distinction between sex with a minor simpliciter and sex with an incredibly young minor. And I think that does make sense. So particularly young kids. That should result in the death penalty. What I would term aggravated sexual assault. So rape, basically, but in legal terms, aggravated sexual assault. But of course, rape needs to be strictly defined because we do live in the post-Me Too era, and there are things that people consider rape that are in fact not. But those things which are rape, yes, absolutely should result in the death penalty. Sometimes I tend to think kidnapping, but kidnapping is such a... If you're kidnapping for reasons that are going to get you executed, it's probably covered by one of those other four, right? So, but for those things, yes, I think that we should be executed. For other crimes, no. Execution you shouldn't be executing people who commit adultery. You shouldn't be, which should be a crime, by the way. Absolutely, it's ridiculous that people think it shouldn't be a crime. You shouldn't be executing prostitutes. You shouldn't be executing people who steal. You shouldn't be executing fraudsters, right? Like it should be limited, certainly. But for those four things, I think yes, absolutely. Human trafficking, unprovoked murder, aggravated sexual assault, and sexual assault of a minor, particularly a minor younger than the age of 16. Absolutely, we should be utilizing the death penalty. The point there is just to say, using it sparingly, certainly, but Romans 13 absolutely gives the government both the right meaning the authority, and the obligation to use the sword to carry out God's wrath. So point number 2, again, I would reject. Point number 3, she says the Imago Dei applies to everyone. The image of God applies to victims and to heinous criminals. If human life has supreme value, that includes even those who have done terrible evil. This is actually a pretty interesting point, not because she has a point, but actually because this is a reason to support the death penalty, not a reason to go against it, right? She says that since the Imago Dei applies to everyone, therefore we shouldn't execute people. But it's interesting because the Bible actually says since the Imago Dei applies to everyone, you should execute people. The biblical logic is actually the exact opposite of Kristan Hawkins' logic, right? Particularly if we go here to Genesis chapter 9 and verses 4. And I'm sorry this is so theological, but, you know, she made theological arguments. So she said, starting at chapter 4, Genesis chapter 9, she says, but you must not eat meat that has lifeblood in it. And for your lifeblood, I will surely demand an accounting. I will demand an accounting from every animal and from every human being too. I will demand an accounting for the life of another human being. This is the crucial point. Verse 6, whosoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed. For, in other words, this is the reason why in the image of God has God made mankind. So, biblical logic, why are we to execute murderers? Because humans are made in the image of God. That's actually, so point number 3 is not an argument against the death penalty. It's actually an argument for the death penalty, at least scripturally speaking, right? So, and we can just move on from that right there. But I just found that to be incredibly interesting because it indicates the exact opposite of what she's trying to prove, right? Number 4, she says, Jesus reframed justice around mercy. The hardest commandment for me is this. Christ calls us to love even our enemies. The woman caught in adultery deserved death under the law. Jesus spared her and called her to conversion. Jesus saved sinners like St. Paul, a persecutor and an accomplice to murder. As Christians, we believe no one is beyond redemption. Execution permanently and for all eternity ends the possibility of repentance. It's hard to claim we love our enemies while insisting they must die. Now, I happen to think this is the best point she makes in this. And it is a fascinating one. I still think it fails, of course. Like I said, I think all the points here fail. But it is, I think, the best point she makes, and it is certainly an interesting one, especially when one considers the pericope adulterae. She should have, under the law, been executed. She's caught in the very act, and Jesus' response is, of course, you who is without sin cast the first stone. Now, is that Jesus repudiating capital punishment? I don't think so. Why? Well, because Paul wrote Romans 13, of course. Paul was under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit when he wrote Romans 13. I don't think Paul could have written Romans 13 if Jesus was against capital punishment. Or if you think of the parable in Luke, I can't remember which chapter. I think it's Luke 18, but I'm not 100% sure which chapter it is off the top of my head. When Jesus talks about the angels gathering together the sinners to bring them before him and slay them before him. Or if you think of the concept of hell, period, right? Clearly, those things, that parable doesn't have any meaning if Jesus is against capital punishment. Romans 13 doesn't have any meaning if Jesus is repudiating capital punishment. Hell is actually incredibly hypocritical if Jesus is against capital punishment. And that's regardless of whether or not you take an annihilationist view or a view of eternal conscious torment. No matter which view you take, it is still incredibly hypocritical for Jesus to say the death penalty is wrong, and also I'm going to throw people into hellfire. That doesn't make any sense, right? You also just have the fact that Jesus never once says the death penalty is wrong anywhere. He could have, but he didn't, right? So what other points do we have to address in her point number 4? Well, there is the fact that the woman caught in adultery, it's not simply as simple as Jesus spared her and called her to conversion. That is true, and that is the disposition Christians should have. More on that in a moment. But it's also true that the Pharisees specifically brought the woman caught in adultery not to try and establish some level of justice, but to try and catch Jesus, to get him in a gotcha, right? Oh, you think we should be showing mercy, but you also say you support the law. So what do you do with this person who was caught in the very act, right? There's no male who's caught in the very act here. There's the question of how was this person caught in the act? How do the Pharisees even know about this sort of thing? And those things just go unaddressed. Why? Because in the Pharisees' mind, they're not relevant. What's relevant is catching Jesus in a gotcha moment, right? So already we have justice being carried out, not for justice sake, but with a cruel and quite frankly, sinful heart, right? We also have the point that Jesus was commanding her after the fact, not neither do I condemn you, period, but neither do I condemn you, comma, go and sin no more, right? So that's obviously an important point that we have, and I don't even think Kristan would disagree with that, to be fair. I don't know if I should call her Kristan or Mrs. Hawkins. We're not on a first-name basis, so maybe it's a little disrespectful of me to call her Kristan. We're going to change to Mrs. Hawkins. Anyways, the most important point here is when she says, as Christians, we believe no one is beyond redemption. I 100% agree with that. I 100% agree with that. And I'll give you an example here that may be particularly important for Kristan Hawkins. Miss Hawkins was a very good friend of Charlie Kirk. I was not a good friend of Charlie Kirk, never met the man, but I was a big fan of Charlie Kirk, right? Which is not the same thing, but it is to say that, to some limited extent, there is a level of empathy the two of us can have with each other, albeit her loss is, of course, much greater than mine. I'm a fan from a distance. She actually knew the man and got to love him and so on and so forth, as a friend would, right? Tyler Robinson, if he is guilty, which so far the courts have not determined whether or not he is or is not, if he is guilty, I think should get the death penalty. I also pray for Tyler Robinson's soul. I do. And I think all Christians should. And I think all Christians should pray for the souls of all who they consider to have wronged them. And just all in general. We should desire that absolutely every person is saved. Now we know that it's not the case that absolutely every person will be saved. Unfortunately, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, because God knows what he's doing. But it is the case that universalism is not true. But it is not the case that we shouldn't want universalism to be true, that we shouldn't desire all people to come to Christ. And I desire Tyler Robinson to come to Christ, while also saying that Tyler Robinson, if he is guilty of the crime, should be executed. Why? Well, it comes down to this claim she makes. It's hard to claim we love our enemies while insisting they must die. And I simply reject that sentence wholeheartedly. And the reason I reject that sentence wholeheartedly is because executions are not an emotional matter. Okay? In a vacuum, it's hard to say you love your enemies while insisting that they should be kidnapped and locked in a cage for the rest of their life. Right? In a vacuum, that's true. But we're not talking about in a vacuum. We're talking about police who have the legal authority to commit said kidnapping when they have a warrant for somebody's arrest. We're talking about a prison sentence that would come down from a judge after finding this man guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. In that particular instance, even though You'd be hard-pressed to convince me you love your enemies by saying we should kidnap them and lock them in a room for the rest of their lives in a vacuum, even though you'd be hard-pressed to convince me of that. Outside of the vacuum, we recognize that, in the words of what was his name? Ja Rule, what's love got to do with it? It's not relevant. We're not talking about love. I can love this individual and still recognize he's committed a heinous crime and needs to be put in a room for the rest of his life, right? It's just simply a fact. So if that's true, then why can that not be true for executions also? I can still love somebody and understand that person has committed a crime that is deserving of the death penalty. In fact, I think Mrs. Hawkins would be hard-pressed to tell me that Old Testament Israelite mothers and fathers did not love their children, and yet the law of Moses commands them not to show favoritism to their children, and if they've committed a heinous crime, to nevertheless turn them over to the authorities to be executed, right? Now, are we to say that those parents were not being loving when they did that? I think that's ridiculous to say those parents were not being loving when they did that, right? And I'm trying to remember where exactly that is. I believe it is, it might be Deuteronomy 21. Let me check here real quick. Deuteronomy 21. Let's see, verse 18. If someone is a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders of the gates of the town. They shall say to the elders, the son of ours is stubborn and rebellious, will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. Then all the men of the town shall stone him. You must purge this evil from among you. No, that's not it. Somebody message me if you guys know the verse I'm talking about. But there is a verse in the Bible. I believe it's in Exodus, now that I'm thinking about it, but I can't remember where. But where God says basically, look, don't show mercy to your kids in this regard when they are guilty of a capital crime. I'm still trying to find it. I shouldn't, because it's gonna derail this whole thing. All right, let's just move on. And in that scenario, I don't think Mrs. Hawkins could or would argue that those parents were being unloving in doing so. And I don't think Mrs. Hawkins could or would argue that God was commanding those parents to be unloving, right? So if it's not unloving biblically, and if you would not use the same logic to call it unloving in that biblical scenario, and if you recognize that doing something that otherwise would be unloving, like kidnapping someone and putting them in a room for the rest of their lives, could in this instance not be unloving because of the fact that we are not talking in a vacuum and we're talking about a very specific set of circumstances, then your point 4 just falls apart, right? Jesus does reframe it all around mercy, but that does not mean that Jesus is anti-death penalty. It does not mean that the sword is bore in vain in Romans 13. It does not mean that we are unloving in saying certain people should be executed for their crimes. It just doesn't follow. So even though I think this is the best point she makes, I still think ultimately it's a flawed point. And we move on. Point number 5, she says, modern society does not need executions. In biblical times, societies had no prisons. Dangerous criminals could not be securely contained. Execution was often the only way to protect society. When killing is no longer necessary to protect society, the pro-life choice is not to kill. And this point falls apart immediately. Number 1, because actually there were prisons in biblical times. And number 2, if there weren't, God could tell people to build them. But he didn't, right? So it's just that simple, right? How simple is this? And the Lord said, build a place to put all the prisoners, or build a place to put all the criminals when you find them guilty of a crime. That's pretty simple. And it's not like they need modern technology to do that. They know how to build buildings, right? Paul himself, remember, was in prison. So not only is it just straight up not true, if it were true, it could very easily not be true, right? All God has to say is build a prison. And voila, a prison is built. The other thing here, as far as like modern societies do not need executions, again, what is your definition of need, right? You're framing this around protection of society, but justice is not meant to protect society. That is a perk of justice. Justice is meant to punish evildoers for doing evil things. A society that does not punish evildoers for doing evil things in a way that their crime is deserving of is a society that falls apart. And we're seeing that in our society. We're seeing that right now with young women being murdered on buses by criminals who should have been executed, right? We're seeing that in the form of execution, Tyler Robinson's assassination. Charlie Kirk's assassination. Tyler Robinson shouldn't have been executed beforehand, but if he had a real fear of the law, he probably would not have done what he did. We see it with the mass murder of babies that me and Mrs. Hawkins agree on, right? The society is falling apart at the seams. At least part of the reason for that is we don't treat criminals the way they are to be treated, particularly heinous criminals, right? And also, why should we be paying for these people ad infinitum? What moral obligation do we have to pay for their hots in a cot, to pay for their running water, to pay for their electricity? Again, that doesn't apply to every criminal, but in some instances, right? What if a guy? I just read the other day a story where a girl and her boyfriend executed the girl's parents and her 8-year-old brother. Why should I? Now, the girl herself was 12 years old and the boyfriend was 23. So the story is incredibly complicated. The boyfriend is a horrible, horrible person. The girl herself was also a horrible person. She's in fact the one who killed her little brother and went on to go brag about it. But obviously, people are going to look at her situation differently, knowing that she was sleeping with a 23-year-old full-grown man. Let's just focus on the full-grown man for the sake of avoiding controversy for a moment. Why should I have to pay money? Now, granted, this is in Ontario, but assuming I was a Canadian citizen, why should I have to pay for that man to live out the rest of his days? He's 23. Assume he lives to be 80 and that he's in prison for the rest of his days. Why should my taxpayer money pay to keep him alive for the next 57 years? When it otherwise would not have done that, by the way, had he not committed the heinous crime. Beats me. Right? So now I'm being punished for the fact that he committed a heinous crime. And he gets to go be at a place where he's probably going to get paroled, where some idiot activist is going to say, well, you guys are mistreating him. He should be allowed to watch TV and have good oatmeal and whatever, you know what I mean? Why? When we could just very simply, hey, guess what? You killed a child and two innocent parents. You also were raping another child, for the record. You're dead. Sorry. Over. Does it suck? Yeah, it sucks. We don't want to execute people. But why shouldn't we in that particular instance? Why should we have to pay for that man's meals, for that man's running water, for that man's electricity, for that man's housing, when if he hadn't committed the crime, we wouldn't have to do that? And he is a heinous murderer and child rapist. I'm going to share with you guys a little anecdote about this story. When the little boy, the 8-year-old, was killed, he tried to fight off his older sister with his toy lightsaber. And she went to a party later on and talked about how funny it was that he gurgled blood after she stabbed him. If that doesn't absolutely break you, I don't know what does. Why on earth should we be advocating for people like that being supported off of our tax dollars? We want the government to be limited, and yet we want to have this massive prison population that could be reduced dramatically if we treated criminals the way they are supposed to be treated. And again, not all of them. I recognize that. But at least in these instances, in that instance right there, yeah, at least one of those two parties needs to be executed at a bare minimum. So yeah, society does need executions. It needs them for monetary reasons. It needs them for justice reasons. And your internal logic here, well, there was no prisons in biblical times. False. Not true. There is prisons in biblical time. Joseph was in a prison before the law was ever given. Paul was in a prison. And it's as simple as God saying, hey, guys, build me a prison. But he didn't do that. You know what he did say? Execute him. So that doesn't work either. Point number 6, the worst point she makes, the church Jesus founded opposes it. The Catechism teaches that capital punishment should almost never be used. Catechism, now, notice this, almost. Catechism 2267 says the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability, and dignity of the person. St. John Paul II, in Evangelium Vitae, cases requiring execution are very rare, if not practically non-existent. A lot of problems with this. Point number 1, Jesus didn't found the Catholic Church. Sorry, didn't happen. False mythology, okay? And you're certainly not going to convince any of your Protestant opponents by saying that when we think that's mythology, right? But more important than the fact that we think it's mythology is the fact that it is mythology, right? And there is no historian in the world who is not a Catholic himself who believes that Jesus founded the Catholic Church. Not one. And there's a reason for that. It's because there's absolutely no historical evidence for it whatsoever. Simply doesn't exist. There's no historical evidence of a Catholic Church existing in the 1st century. And what I mean here is the Roman Church, right? There is no historical evidence of a Roman Church existing in the 2nd century. There is no historical evidence of the Roman Church existing in the 3rd century. No, not the church in Rome, but the modern Roman Catholic Church. Make sure we're understanding the argument here. And even in the 4th century, the Roman Catholic Church still does not exist. It's only beginning to exist. The vast majority of historians recognize that the Catholic Church cannot in any meaningful sense be said to exist until sometime between the 5th and 7th centuries AD. Even if we stretch that only to the 4th century AD with things like the Council of Nicaea and stuff like that, if you took 300 years from now in the past, 1726 is the year you'd be landing on. 1726, if you're born in 1726, you'd be 50 when the Declaration of Independence was signed, right? That's how far away we are from 1726. And in the first 3 centuries, 300 years of Christianity, there is no historical evidence of the Roman Catholic Church existence at all. Not even a lick of it. So no, sorry, Jesus did not found this church. That's the first problem. The second problem is actually right here in your own statement. You say, almost never be used. Almost never be used means sometimes it should be used. You say, John Paul II said cases requiring execution are very rare, if not practically non-existent. Guess what? Very rare means sometimes they happen, right? Something that's rare can be found. That's just definitional. So by this statement itself, right, we see that the Roman Catholic Church, John Paul II specifically, is saying that in some instances, executions probably can happen. Although he does point out, he does say, if not practically non-existent. The third problem with this, and this is actually the biggest problem, yes, even bigger than the fact that Jesus did not actually found this church, which, Ms. Hawkins, if you care to debate me on this issue, we can. I've debated it before. Obviously, you don't have to. This isn't some like debate me bro stuff. I wouldn't disrespect you in that way. But it's a very easily defendable proposition on my part. The Catholic Church didn't oppose the death penalty until 8 years ago. Yeah. So just note that for a second. When she says the church Jesus founded opposes it, didn't in 2017 or 16 or 15 or 14 or 1914 or 1814 or 1714 or 1614 or etc. Right? The Catholic Church only changed their position on the death penalty in the pontificate of Pope Francis. which, by the by, that should be an argument against the primacy of the Pope and against the Catholic Church being the apostolic traditional faith. Because in this instance, on August 1st, 2018, the Catholic Church Catechism is actually saying that not only is execution morally permissible, it's actually required. I'll read you that in a moment. And then on August 2nd, 2018, the day after, no longer is it morally required. It's, in fact, morally inadmissible in all cases. How does that work? Right? Morality, I'm almost certain Mrs. Hawkins agrees with me on this. Morality does not change. Morality is objective. Morality is absolute. Morality is unchanging and based in the very nature of God. How can something be morally permissible on one day and then the next day no longer morally permissible? How can something be morally obligatory one day and then the next day no longer even permissible? That doesn't work. The Roman Catholic Church, for the overwhelming majority of its history, believed that the death penalty was actually not only permitted, but required. Let me read you the catechism before 2018. It says, and here, let me actually go ahead and pull up it in a full quote, okay? Because I only have a partial quote up right now. Sorry, I don't know why Google's not helping me here. Catholic Church Catechism on Death Penalty before 2018. All right. Now, I apologize for the dead air, friends. We are going to obviously get this out here. So here's a quote from Pope Innocent. This is not catechism, but it's a quote from Pope Innocent I in the 400s. He says, "It must be remembered that power was granted by God, and to avenge crime, the sword was permitted. He who carries out this vengeance is God's minister. What motive have we for condemning a practice that all hold to be permitted by God? We uphold, therefore, what has been observed until now in order not to alter the discipline and so that we may not appear to act contrary to God's authority." Pope Innocent III in the 1200s says, "We declare that the secular power cannot without mortal sin impose a judgment of blood provided the punishment is carried out." Hang on, let me restart this. "We declare that the secular power can, without mortal sin, impose a judgment of blood provided the punishment is carried out not in hatred, but with good judgment, not inconsiderately, but after mature deliberation." Thomas Aquinas also and by the way, you can just find these all on the Wikipedia page for Catholic Church and capital punishment. That's what I'm reading it on right now. Thomas Aquinas defended the death penalty, saying, "For those who have been appropriately appointed, there is no sin in administering punishment. For those who refuse to obey God's laws, it is correct for society to rebuke them with civil and criminal sanctions. No one sins working for justice within the law. Actions that are necessary to preserve the good of society are not inherently evil." And he goes on from there, right? Then we have the Catholic Catechism here that I was trying to read for you guys. Let's make sure to find the right place. Come on, really? 1566, Catechism of the Council of Trent says, "Another kind of lawful slaying belongs to the civil authorities, to whom is entrusted power of life and death by the legal and judicious exercise of which they punish the guilty and protect the innocent. The just use of this power, far from involving the crime of murder, is an act of paramount obedience to this commandment which prohibits murder. The end of the commandment is the preservation and security of human life. Now, the punishment inflicted by the civil authority, which is the legitimate avenger of crime, naturally tends to this end, since they give security to life by repressing outrage and violence. Hence these words of David, in the morning I put to death all the wicked of the land, that I might cut off all the workers of iniquity from the city of the Lord." Notice what this text says, Mrs. Hawkins. Says that not only is the just use of power not a crime, they say it's an act of paramount obedience to the commandment. Right? That's at the Council of Trent, 1566. In that scenario, that is literally your church is saying it's obligatory to execute certain criminals. If it was obligatory then, it can't not be obligatory now. That's not how morality works. Right? So not only did Jesus not found this church, but this was actually considered morally obligatory by this church. And we just went from 400s, which, again, it's questionable whether or not you can even say the Catholic Church truly exists in the 400s, but at the very least, he was called Pope Innocent, so we can grant that, right? We just went from the 400s to the 1500s, 1,100 years of the official Catholic position being the death penalty is not only morally permissible, but morally commanded, right? And then we move all the way up here until finally in 2018, your church says that the death penalty is not permissible. So we should just change our view because in the last 8 years, the Catholic Church recently bonked itself on the head and got more progressive. And that's, again, disregarding the fact that I don't think that the Catholic Church was actually founded by Jesus Christ. I don't think there's any evidence to support that. And the vast majority of historians agree with me. Not that that means I'm right, but it is an interesting fact nevertheless, right? And that's also disregarding the fact that as a Protestant, I don't care what the Catholic Church has to say. The Catholic Church says that the death penalty is not permissible. Well, good for them. Fantastic. I don't care. And I won't care, right? Because I'm not Catholic. So it's just, not only is this an argument that you can't demonstrate Jesus founded the church, but it's also an argument that even if you could demonstrate that the Catholic Church was consistent in this, and that's the other thing, you can't demonstrate that they're consistent in this position because they're actually contradicting themselves. But even if you could demonstrate that they were consistent in this position, I just don't care because of that first point. And you can't prove that first point, so you got to just let this go by the wayside. Early Christianity, she says, was skeptical of execution. Early Christians often opposed capital punishment. The church historically leaned towards preserving life whenever possible. This is kind of true. Obviously, we just read for you guys Pope Innocent I. That's in the 400s. So how early is a question that we should ask. Augustine, of course, also supported the death penalty. Right? Now, it is true that there were various figures who did oppose the death penalty. Justin Martyr opposed capital punishment. Origen was against capital punishment. Cyprian, specifically Cyprian of Carthage, also opposed the death penalty. But as we just pointed out, Pope Innocent did not. Also, Augustine did not, right? Ambrose did not, even though he did say that it was admirable if they did refrain. Clement of Alexandria did not. And actually, funnily enough, even though Tertullian and Origen were against, which, by the way, none of those are considered church fathers by the Catholic Church anyway, even though those two did condemn the death penalty, they actually accepted it as necessary for the civil realities of the state. So they didn't think Christians should participate in it, but they did think that it was just a necessary reality. Both of them, right? So they're not even as firm against the death penalty as somebody like Mrs. Hawkins would actually like. So some in the early church were skeptical of execution, absolutely, but others weren't. So that argument doesn't go anywhere. You say tomato, I say tomato. You have your pet church fathers, I have mine. And even some of your pet church fathers end up agreeing with me, right? And it's funnily enough, Origen and Tertullian aren't even church fathers, like I said. So anyways, pro-life does not mean pro-crime. Point number 8, opposing the death penalty does not mean being soft on crime. Murder deserves serious punishment. Violent criminals must be removed from society. Life imprisonment protects society without killing. Being pro-life doesn't mean criminals go free. It means we punish without becoming killers ourselves. Now, this is very interesting because the first sentence is actually just like objectively wrong. Opposing the death penalty does not mean being soft on crime. If life imprisonment is softer on crime than the death penalty, then definitionally, yeah, it does, actually. You are softer on crime than I am. Sorry, just the way it is. But the other thing here is, again, we've seen how these things work out. People who have life imprisonment. You guys know Son of Sam was offered parole? Now, he converted to Christianity, and he actually rejected the parole himself, thinking that he was not deserving of it. But Son of Sam, guy who just murdered people indiscriminately, was offered parole. Do you know that? Do you know Ted Bundy was allowed to get married and have conjugal rights in prison? Bet you didn't know that at all, did you? I have been to at least juvie, and I have friends who have been to jail and to prison. Rehabilitated, of course, right? I'm not hanging out with criminals, but... And all of them have said, yeah, it's really not that bad, at least not where we live. Obviously, that's going to depend on where you go to prison. There's no doubt about that. But at least here in Idaho, in fact, one of my friends who ended up serving prison time said that that prison was actually better, because he had been to juvie, jail, and prison, said prison was actually better than the other two. And he had been committed to a psychiatric ward and a rehabilitation center before this. He was a very troubled person before he ended up reforming his life. And he said the prison was actually the best of the five, right? Said it was easy. So we know how these things end up working out. We get some activist that says that's cruel and unusual punishment, and you need to give them an opportunity to rehabilitate themselves, and they should be given parole, and they should be given nice, powdered donuts and whatever, right? And so ultimately, yeah, it is soft on crime. Guess what? No activist can come after the fact and say, well, we need to give that guy parole if he's not around anymore, right? It's not even possible to be soft on crime in that regard. Life imprisonment for heinous criminals opens the door for progressives to force us to be soft on crime. That door is shut, in fact, slammed violently when we support capital punishment. Pro-life does not mean pro-crime, but the way you define pro-life is not pro-life. You don't have and that's the other point here, you don't have a monopoly on what defines pro-life. And actually, in point number 9, we're going to get to the thing that destroys this entire argument. So let's actually get to that. Point number 9, war versus execution. War and capital punishment are morally different. War should be avoided and must meet just war standards. Killing in war is done to protect innocent people and defend a nation. Execution kills someone who's already contained and no longer a threat. Killing an enemy on a battlefield is not the same as killing someone who has been locked in a prison cell for decades. Now, this is the point where the entire argument unravels. We've already rejected points 1 through 8, but this point actually destroys Mrs. Hawkins' entire initial claim. Because what's her initial claim? That you cannot support the death penalty and be consistently pro-life. That's her claim. What is the pro-life position? Me and Mrs. Hawkins will actually agree on this. The pro-life position, and of course, it's the abolition of abortion. We understand that. But what is the root of why we want abortion abolished? It's not that killing is always wrong. It's not that killing is never morally permissible. How do I know me and Mrs. Hawkins agree with that? Because she just gave us in point number 9 just an example of justified killing. Mrs. Hawkins believes that killing in times of war is justified, or at least permissible, whatever word she'd like to use, right? Which means she cannot mentally assent to the proposition killing a human being is never morally permissible. So what is the pro-life position then? It is killing an innocent human being is never morally permissible. But wait a minute, Your Honor, the death penalty is exclusively meant to kill people who are not innocent, isn't it? Yeah, actually, Prosecution? It sure is. The very fact that Mrs. Hawkins grants that killing another human being can be morally permissible in some circumstances completely destroys the proposition that one cannot be for the death penalty and consistently pro-life. Because the pro-life proposition at its core is that taking innocent human life is wrong. That's what my belief is. That's what Russell Hunter's belief is. That's what Charlie Kirk's belief was. That's what Mrs. Kristan Hawkins' belief is. And if that's the case, if that's the proposition, there is nothing inconsistent about saying it is always morally impermissible to take innocent human life and saying it is sometimes morally permissible to take guilty human life. There's no contradiction. There's no A and not A. There is no inconsistency therein, which means this entire argument falls apart, right? And that's the crux of the issue. If you're going to tell me that it's morally impermissible to take all human life, then you might have an argument. You might have a consistent life ethic argument. But if you're not going to make that argument, if you're going to say in instances of war or in instances of self-defense or in any other instance that you might conjure up, it can sometimes be morally permissible to take human life, then that means you are not mentally ascending to the proposition that it is always morally impermissible to take human life. Therefore, you must be assenting to the proposition it is always morally impermissible to take innocent human life. But if that's the proposition you're defending, if that's the pro-life proposition that we agree on, well, there's nothing inconsistent about removing the word innocent there and placing the word guilty and then changing that permissible to impermissible, or that permissible to impermissible to permissible, rather, right? So in making point number 9, Mrs. Hawkins, you've defeated your entire argument. It is always impermissible to take innocent human life. Therefore, it follows that it may sometimes be permissible to take guilty human life, right? It doesn't mean necessarily it is, but it does mean that that latter position is not inconsistent with the former. And that's the claim she's making, that it is inconsistent for somebody to defend the idea, for somebody to defend the idea for somebody to be pro-life, there we go, and be for the death penalty. Well, according to your own logic, it's actually not inconsistent, Mrs. Hawkins. All right, let's get through. We got 2 more points. Economic reality is point number 10. Capital punishment costs more than life imprisonment. Taxpayers often pay far more for executions than for life sentences. If life imprisonment protects society, taxpayers shouldn't have to pay extra to execute someone. This is a very easily solvable problem. Life imprisonment is less cost effective at this current stage than executions because we take 45 years to execute people. And that's just not something that we should do, right? As it stands right now, we very rarely actually execute anybody on death row. In fact, let me pull up the exact numbers here. How many people on death row in the U.S. between 2,000 and 2,100? All right. How many people on death row in the U.S. are executed? (46 to 48), which is a rise over the last few years. All right. So let's take the high number for executions and the low number for incarcerations to make this as positive for Mrs. Hawkins as we possibly can. That means that 2.4% of people on death row were executed last year. 2.4%. Now, let's do one last thing here. How long are people on death row? Typically 20 to 23 years. Okay, on average. Another source here says the average is 19.4 years. So it's 2 different sources. Let's just say 19 for the sake of it. Okay, 19 years. On average, you're on death row for 19 years. Only 2.4% of people on death row were executed last year. So why is it less cost effective to execute people? Well, because we keep them for 2 decades on death row. And we go through all these different legal hoops to try and prevent them from being executed. Notice that most of the time when these appeals are happening, people are not trying to argue that the person is innocent. Nobody was trying to argue that John Wayne Gacy or Charles Manson were innocent. They were trying to argue against the death penalty, saying the death penalty wasn't permissible in this particular circumstance. So if we as a nation simply changed our policies, and we can't do it nationally, we can't do it nationally. It has to be done on the state level because it's just not the federal government's job to get involved in these sorts of things. But say my state, Idaho, said, all right, new law, unless you have new evidence suggesting that you are not guilty or you are challenging a guilty verdict itself, right? And the judge accepts that that you have reason to challenge that guilty verdict itself. Unless you're appealing in those instances, if you're found guilty, you will be executed within the calendar year. Maybe not within the calendar year, because I guess if you're convicted on December 23rd, that means it's got to happen like right now, and you don't even have a chance, right? Within a year, let's do year to date. A year to date of the time that you have been found, that you have been sentenced to death, you will be executed. Guess what? Now, it's actually no longer expensive for taxpayers. So that falls to the wayside right there. And it's not the death penalty itself that is causing people to spend more money. It's actually people like Mrs. Hawkins who are causing the death penalty to be more expensive, because they keep trying to say, well, we need to get through all these different hoops to try and make sure that this person is not receiving the death penalty, or at the very least that, and look, to be fair, if they are genuinely innocent, yes, if you have reason to believe that this person was maybe not treated fairly in their court, appeals courts are there for a reason. I'm not saying that every single person necessarily should have to be executed within a year to the date of their sentencing. But if you don't have any evidence that you are not guilty, if we find, for example, Ted Bundy guilty, and he appeals on the grounds that he is not that he's not guilty, and the judge in the appeals court looks over that and says, actually, there's no good evidence here, they did their job, well, then guess what? Within a year of you being found guilty, you will be executed. And I can give you another way we can make this pretty cost effective. No electric chair, no lethal injection, execution by hanging or firing squad. It's pretty dirt cheap. And if people want to say that's cruel and unusual punishment, no, it is not. Firing squad and hanging are near instantaneous deaths in almost all circumstances. Okay, so it is not cruel and unusual punishment. That's ridiculous. Quite frankly, the electric chair and lethal injection are incredibly torturous comparatively to firing squad and hanging. But yeah, what do bullets cost? Like 12 cents? You know what I mean? 12 cents for an individual bullet, I mean? What does a rope cost that you can continuously use over and over and over again? $2.50? Right? So the economic reality, if it wasn't for people who were against the death penalty, the economic reality would not be the economic reality. And it's very easy to change. So again, we reject that point. Last point, point number 11. The human cost is real. Supporting the death penalty means requiring someone else to do the killing. Someone must pull the lever, push the syringe, or press the button. That burden falls on prison workers and medical personnel. That responsibility leaves a permanent mark on their conscience. If I support the death penalty, I'm asking someone else to do the killing for me. And that would be a good point if, again, you hadn't already granted me that you could allow somebody to do the killing for you, for example, in the case of a soldier. Potentially, I imagine you would say the same thing in self-defense. I imagine you believe a police officer is legally justified in killing in certain circumstances, of course, not all circumstances. Police use of force, use of lethal force should be limited, no doubt. The fact that you've granted that already, that there can be sometimes legal justification for killing, well, you're not doing that killing. You're not on the front lines fighting that battle. You're asking someone else, someone who's typically between the ages of 18 and 22, I might add, to do that killing for you. So what's the difference? If it's wrong in the one instance, why is it not wrong in the other instance? Well, because this is a necessary killing. Okay, well, I suggest to you that the death penalty is a necessary killing. So now we have an argument. Now we go back to your point number one, right? About the definition of justice. Justice according to who? You say justice doesn't require executions. I say it does. So by which standard are we going to judge this? Can't be the Catholic Church standard, because I don't believe the Catholic Church has any authority. Can't be the Church Father standard, because they're inconsistent with each other. Can't be the Bible standard, because then I win. And you don't want that, right? So by what standard are we saying that justice does not require execution of another individual? Which, by the way, I would just simply point out, now that I'm thinking about it, point number one is actually begging the question, right? You're saying justice doesn't require execution, but that's actually what you're supposed to be demonstrating, is that justice doesn't require execution. So you're actually committing a logical fallacy in making that point in the first place. But yeah, if you're already telling me it's permissible for somebody to kill somebody else in certain circumstances, and also that you're not going to do it, which, by the way, I don't believe women should be in the military anyhow, so I'm not judging you for that. I'm just pointing out the logic, right? Then you've already granted to me that it is okay to hire someone to execute somebody else in certain circumstances. And I am simply suggesting this is one of those circumstances. Does that mean the human cost is not real? Of course the human cost is real. Of course it is. And it sucks. Anytime human life is lost for any reason, it sucks. Me and you, Mrs. Hawkins, are in complete and total agreement in that regard. That sucks. It sucks when Allied soldiers have to kill Nazi soldiers. That sucks. That's a horrible loss of human life. No doubt about it. Because a human being is an image bearer of God, and it sucks that that person has to die. But guess what? Sometimes things just suck. They just do. Right? And I want to end this on a note here. I emailed Mrs. Hawkins about whether or not she might be willing to debate this issue with me. Obviously, the likelihood of that happening is pretty low. She's pretty busy individual and also has a fairly large platform. I do not. So, maybe she sees the 1,800 subs we have on the other channel and the 65 moderated debates, and that's enough. I hope it is. That would be very cool. But maybe it's not. And I'm not judging her if she says that it's not. Okay. Again, I have nothing but respect for Mrs. Hawkins. But I would like to challenge you, Mrs. Hawkins, if you're up to it, to a formal debate, or even a discussion. If you want to just come on the channel, that's fine. But I would prefer a formal debate on the thesis that a consistent pro-life worldview says if killing isn't necessary, we shouldn't do it. Or let's actually, no, forget that. Let's go up. A consistent pro-life worldview cannot support the death penalty. That would be the thesis. I would take the negative. You would take the affirmative. Okay. I have numerous friends who would certainly be willing to host it. My friend James Coons runs the Modern Day Debate channel. They got, I think, over 100,000 subs at this point. He would love to host it. My friend Donnie Badinsky hosts the Standing for Truth channel. He tends to host religious debates. He would love to. My friend Marlon Wilson hosts the Gospel Truth channel. Also tends to be religious debates, but I'm sure he would love to host it. Right. So if you ever end up seeing this and you're up to it, I would love to debate you on the thesis, a consistent pro-life ethic cannot support the death penalty. Again, I'd be taking the negative, you'd be taking the affirmative, and I can assure you, you would be treated nothing but respectfully, because I do respect you. And I think this position is wildly wrong, and I reject all of your points. But obviously, it's reasonable minds can disagree, I think, right? So if you ever end up seeing this and you're up to it, let's do it. That'd be awesome. If you're not up to that, but would be up to a discussion, whether that be on this channel or on my bigger channel, where we do apologetics, I'd also be up for that. But again, I do prefer the formal debate. And also, please, and I'm speaking as if I'm speaking to Mrs. Hawkins. Again, I have no idea if she'll ever see this. In fact, she probably won't. But if you do, please don't take this as like, oh, debate me, bro, something like that. No, I recognize that you're a busy person and that you have a large platform. And I recognize that you also may see this as primarily benefiting me because I have a small platform, and you'd be bringing a lot of people to, bringing me to the attention of a lot of different folks who wouldn't know about me. I understand that as well, right? So you don't obviously owe anyone a debate, and please don't take it that way. But I think it would be incredibly edifying if we had such a debate, and I'd like to respectfully send this challenge out to you if you'd be willing. With that, friends, we're going to go ahead and get out of here. I know this isn't like our usual. This is really more like a Watchdog special report, but it is recent news, and so I did want to talk about it. If you liked this video, please remember to like and share this video and consider subscribing to the channel if you have not done so. Hit the bell to get notified every time that we go live. Remember to leave any questions, comments, criticisms, concerns, critiques, or anything of that nature in the comment section down below. Remember that you can follow us on various social media platforms, all of which are linked in the description below. If you'd like to support the work we do here, you can subscribe to the Patreon, link below. Buy my book, 15 Questions for Calvinists Answered, link below, or give a one-time donation to the PayPal, link below. You also can find links to my other channels, my religious channel, which will be on at 9 p.m. Mountain Time, discussing this exact issue from a more explicitly theological perspective, which is funny because this was already pretty theological anyway. But we'll be discussing that again later on tonight, Lord willing. So please do consider checking that out, subscribing. Link is also below. And a link to my music channel, because I make hip-hop music. And there's, like I said, a link below there as well. Last link below is a link to my paper on the DoD deception argument, why Dr. Tim Stratton's DoD argument fails. Please do consider checking that out as well. And friends, I want to remind you guys to be watchdogs, to be vigilant. And as we do every single episode, I'd like to ask you the question. In the face of Armageddon, will you compromise